So it looks like most people in the waiting room have been admitted, and more people will come along, I think, as we go on. So I think at this point we might want to just get started with the interview, so we have enough time to do everything that we had planned. Thank you everyone for coming today to the first of SAD 2021, the interviews. Today, we'd like to welcome Michael Batty. Michael Batty is the director and now chairman of the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis at the University College London. His work focuses on computer models of city systems, and he is one of the rare few people to have won the Alonzo Prize of the Regional Science Association twice. So I'm sure that there's plenty more information that I could give about Mike, but the goal for today is to learn a little bit through an interview and have just a quick chat about kind of life and times of spatial analysis from Mike's perspective. So I'm Levi Wolf. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol, and my co-hosts today are Rachel Franklin, if you want to say hello.
I do want to say hello, if I can unmute myself. This is auspicious. Glad to be here.
And Denny Arribas-Bel.
Hello.
So to get started, I think I'll sort of lead off here, asking a few questions. So let me remove the spotlight. Wonderful. So to get started, Mike, there's so much about all of your scholarship and your body of work that I'm sure that many people here today are going to know about, maybe be familiar with. But something I'm particularly fascinated is kind of your history as a scholar, moving from place to all these different sort of interesting locales. So I'd like to get to know a little bit more about that. You know, what was the course of your journey? So starting off, I guess you started off at Manchester, you know, when you did your undergrad in town and country planning. So it sounded like, at least, your training at that stage was quite diverse. How would you describe you kind of getting into what you do?
Well, I went to Manchester in 1962 as an undergraduate, and in those days, the planning program was 5 years. It was like architecture, and planning was part of the architecture school. And you sort of, basically did sort of architecture, planning, etc. for the first 3 years, and then you chose to do planning or architecture, basically. So I chose planning. And of course, the reason why I went to planning school was largely because I was quite good at drawing at school. And I remember that when I went in the sixth form, of course, in those days, I mean, we had the 11 plus, and everybody really was, those who passed it, basically about 20% of the population, the age group, basically were divided then into boys and girls. So there were girls' grammar schools and boys' grammar schools. So the school I went to, Quarry Bank in Liverpool, basically continued to stream us all the way through. And when we got to the sixth form, there were very few of us left. Only about 6 or 8 kids went to university in that school, and it was one of about 5 or 6 boys' grammar schools in Liverpool. That was a big city in those days, and so consequently, I went there because basically I went to planning school for the simple reason that I could draw quite well, and my dad discovered a prospectus of some of his friends, basically, called Town and Country Planning. And of course, my dad and mum came from Manchester, basically, so they knew it. So I basically just applied to Manchester and was accepted. I didn't apply to any other universities at that particular point. I thought I might go to, try for the Oxbridge exams or something, but my dad said, oh, there's no point. He said, you might as well do something properly, you know, and sort of, so planning was what I did basically. And I spent basically, I mean, the 5 years course was incredible because we spent 80% of the time in the studio, basically. I mean,
Wow.
all of us had to buy double elephant sized drawing boards and geometrical instruments and so on. And I remember the first exercise, I mean, well, I should tell you that in the sixth form basically interviewed us all about planning. And he said to me, he said, why do you want to do town and country planning? He said, do you know what town and country planning is about? And I said to him, well, it's about drawing plans, basically. And he said, have you ever heard of Patrick Abercrombie? So I said, no. He's a Liverpool man, of course, Abercrombie, who did the London plan and so on. And so he told me to go away and find out about town planning. And when I'd found something out, come back and see him. So that was another reason for doing planning. But it was all drawing, basically. Our first exercise in planning school was to take a piece of double elephant cartridge paper, divide it into 4 squares by 3 squares. And in the first... in the top left-hand corner of the cartridge paper, we would draw with a compass a perfect circle, touching it. And then for the next 3 days, we had to practice doing it freehand, basically, using sort of greaseproof paper and so on. And finally, when we finished, when we had to submit the drawing, basically, we had to draw these circles basically freehand in the other 11 squares basically on the paper. And really that sort of says what it was all about. I mean, we then moved on to measuring street furniture and traffic lights and stuff. And then eventually by the end of the first year, we were actually looking at towns and so on. So anyway, and of course buildings, you know, in that sense.
Yeah, geez. From circles all the way to plans. That's
exactly.
That's pretty wild.
Well, of course.
So it sounds like the training was pretty broad.
Yeah, the problem was that, you know, most of us thought that circles were plans, basically. One of the dilemmas of cities is that we think of them in those terms, I guess.
Yeah, wow. Well, at least it sounds like very broad and sort of definitely like a lot of different things at the same,
yeah. It was a total change, of course, the 60s. I mean, the year we went to university, of course, the Beatles basically went to #1 sort of overnight, really. And the whole of the 60s was dominated by this sort of pretty optimistic feeling in Britain, I think, at the time, in that sense. And of course, it was academia in very diverse ways was beginning to explode. The social sciences were sort of trying to emulate the physical sciences as they had done in North America during the 1940s and 50s, really, in that sense. And so that really kind of hit us in the later years of the planning program, that there were people out there thinking that, you know, we might be able to look at cities as a science, really. Planning could be the systems approach, as it was called in those days.
Sure. Sort of manageable and rational systems.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So could you walk me through a little bit then how that kind of feeling changed after you left Manchester and ended up at Reading?
Well, I moved to Reading as a research assistant in '69 on a project which was to do with the Centre for Environmental Studies being set up as a sort of think tank, and they awarded, Peter Hall got the grant basically because he was the head of the department then. And we had a project for 3 or 4 years looking at urban models, and then I became a lecturer. Of course, Reading was a great place, largely because of Peter. To some extent, it was a sort of sleepy place in one way, but of course, Peter lived in London, Peter Hall, and he would used to...
And that's Peter Hall, yeah.
Yeah, he used to drive out to Reading, you know, sort of just as everybody was about to go home, he would enter the department at 100 miles an hour in his Audi, basically, and sort of start another day's work, basically, overnight. And so Peter basically had lots of friends, fantastic network. And of course, Reading was not very far from the airport. So these people would touch down, you know, and Peter would pick them up and bring them to Reading to give us a seminar. So, you know, I met a lot of people during those 10 years at Reading, people like Brian Berry, Les Curry, all the sort of quantitative geographers of old, really, in a sense, and planners as well, of course, Peter Self and all sorts of people, you know,
Wow. Yeah. It sounds like, you know, favorable location, good environment, and, you know, quality.
Yeah. Of course, I never thought of myself really as a geographer, you see, in that sense. I mean, although, you know, I was beginning to look at geographical techniques and spatial analysis, I never thought of myself as a geographer. So it's pretty natural at the end of the 70s, as it were, to apply for a job in a planning school, basically. And that's when I moved to Cardiff, basically, at that point. And I don't think I thought of myself as a geographer, because in those days, you sort of had to be, you had to have this view about physical and human geography, the integrated sort of subject area. I never really quite had that, being trained in a different sort of domain, really, in that way. Although, you know, I acquired over the years sort of lots of interests in geographical claims, but mainly human geography. I've never done much physical type stuff.
Yeah, the field was definitely very different at that time. And I'm sure the move to Cardiff was, you know, a hell of a thing. Totally different kind of environment than Reading. Also, you know, a different nation technically, and a capital city of that nation. Can you talk to me a little bit about how your time in Cardiff at UIST, how that was different from Reading?
Well, I mean, it was UIST was the College of Advanced Technology in Cardiff in the 50s, and it became a college of the University of Wales. The University of Wales, like the University of London, really, with the colleges. You know, they all gave degrees centrally at the university, and UIST became the one of the colleges, well, the last college really to join in the 60s when the university system was expanding. And it was very small. It had 16 departments, and there were 32 professors, two professors per department, basically. I was the second professor in the Department of Town Planning. It was very applied engineering. There was really no social science. There was actually, that's not quite true. The Cardiff Business School came out of that, but a little bit of social science, but mainly engineering, built environment, architecture and stuff. And it was a very interesting place because the staff, the faculty were very good in my view, probably the best place I've ever worked at one level. And I think I told you this before, Levi, that one of the things about Wales was that there were lots of bright people who were Welsh who went to English universities. And then, of course, some of them wanted to come back to Wales. So in the Department of Town Planning, there was Gareth Rees and Phil Cook, who were both Welsh speaking. Richard Davis, who became Vice Chancellor of Swansea eventually, Pat O'Farrell, a variety of people like that. There were some quite good quantitative people like Ian Bracken and so on. So it was a good place intellectually, but of course, in terms of the contrast of styles, I mean, planning at that point was going through, it had gone through its scientific phase in the 60s, that went quickly, and it moved into political economy. And now, of course, it's in administration by and large, but political economy in the 70s and 80s. And so it was a battlefield really over the curriculum. It was a remarkable battlefield, Cardiff, in that sense. An interesting place to live. You soon got dispelled of the notion of referring to yourself as English. And we're only 30 miles, Cardiff's only 30 miles across the border it's only 30 miles from you, Levi, at Bristol, basically, 35 miles. And so, yeah, it was an interesting place. There were some very good people there, actually, at the time,
Yeah, so then you talk a little bit about the kind of experience of being a planner there, and then you go further to a geographical environment, but not just any one. You went to one of the 3 sites of the National Center for Geographic Information Analysis at Buffalo, which at the time was a very sort of influential investment in geography as the field in the US. So how did you see that move? Did it feel like the place to be at the time?
In Cardiff, we had a pretty big group of people who were involved in what ultimately came to be called GIS. These were the regional research labs were put together in the mid to late 80s, and they were the equivalent in some sense. It was like a decentralized NCGIA, really, in that sense. And so GIS came very quickly into these regional research labs. And Cardiff, Neil Wrigley, really led the lab, and me and Paul Long was a lecturer and so on, and Dave Martin was a PhD student, and a variety of people who you would know, David Owen and Anne Green were there. We had a lot, Gary Higgs, we had a lot of very good people in that. So we got to know about GIS, and I was doing that. So it was sort of, you know, we'd met lots of people in quantitative geography, and so it was not so unnatural to move to Buffalo. I knew Ross McKinnon, who was the acting NCGIA director, who wasn't really a working academic. He was also Dean of Arts and Sciences, I think, as well. He'd been head of Department of Geography. And so he offered me a job, basically. And Stuart Fotheringham, who'd been spending a year at Cardiff, also moved to the NCGA. And a year after that, I moved to it in that sense. But I've got to say that one of the reasons for moving was that in the mid-80s, I became head of department. And in those days, in my contract, the head of departmentship was for life, basically. I was the second professor, and it said that if the first professor moves, then the second professor will become head of department, and it was head of department for life. There was no rotation, and it just drove me wild. I mean, I just couldn't hack it, basically, in that
I
sense.
assume drove you wild in a bad way.
Drove me wild in a bad way, absolutely. So to some extent, I thought it was a good idea to actually move at that point, and I got the offer and moved to the NCGIA. Yeah.
And that sounded like a pretty dynamic environment there. There were a lot of people that you were interested in.
Yeah, it was very good. I mean, it was a great time. I was there 5 years, and there were some very good people at Buffalo. It had always had excellent people, Buffalo, in the quantitative geography. Dwayne Marble had just left Buffalo for Ohio State when I arrived. Dan Griffiths had moved to Syracuse, a variety of people like that who'd been through the department. And one of the interests about Buffalo in those days was there was a variety of people there who were interested in fractals, because me and Paul Longley were just putting together our fractals book in the late 80s. And the variety of people at Buffalo involved in fractals, but not in human geography. David Mark and Babs Buttonfield and Athol Abrahams are all, and Mike Waldenberg, they're all physical geographers studying things like rivers and terrain, landscapes, and so on, using fractals. And that was quite interesting in a sense, because it pulled things together for me in that sense.
Sure.
And of course, at the same time, we had Pete Rogerson and Stuart Fotheringham and so on, Paul Densham involved in the urban and regional side of things, you know.
So it was like a whole community of scholars that were interested in similar things, not just humans or not just physical.
Yeah, it was, the NCGIA was sort of, we were the Buffalo, and the more generic GIS, I think, was over at Santa Barbara. And then, of course, the geomatics bit was at the University of Maine with Andrew Frank and Max Eggenhofer. And so it was it was a very interesting place to be. I mean, Buffalo was a great place to live, actually. I have a lot of time for Buffalo. It was very easy to live there. I mean, you know, living in London is like, you know, walking through treacle most of the time. It's really hard work. I mean, but living in Buffalo is easy. You'd fly into Toronto. You could park your car cheaply at Toronto and go back to the UK and this sort of thing. So you drive in round the back across the Lewiston Bridge, basically, and then go into the back at Amherst in Buffalo. It's so easy to actually live there. Quite amazing. Yeah.
Sounds idyllic. I mean, but I don't want to spoil any of the story, but it does sound like you did move back at one point or another. What kind of influenced that decision?
Well, when we moved to Buffalo, our son went to boarding school here. I mean, there's another story involved in the Welsh schooling system, basically, in that sense. But and I won't bore you with that. But we moved to Buffalo, and my wife, you know, she was a lecturer in estate management or something like that at the Poly of Wales. She too is a town planner. We were both in the same year at Manchester, and anyway, we moved there, and she did a PhD in political science. So one of the things about moving back was our son was about to go to university in the UK, and my wife had finished her PhD. Although I did flirt with the idea of staying in some sense. I mean, I enjoyed Buffalo, but I nearly moved in *93 to the University of Pennsylvania in city planning. Basically, I was offered a job. Well, anybody in the American system who's applying, who's being touted for a job actually applies for it, right? I mean, sort of, yeah, those of you who are Americans will know that they bring people in and, you know, look them over and this sort of thing, quite different from the British system. But I nearly moved to Penn, basically, into city planning, but for a whole variety of reasons, I didn't.
Sure.
And then I got this offer to come back to UCL. One of the reasons for the development of CASA was that in London, there was really no regional research laboratory. There's RRL in Leicester and Edinburgh, and one in Cardiff, of course, Cardiff, Bristol, and so on. But there was one in London, but it was Birkbeck and LSE, and they were arguing about something. But the GIS was actually between Birkbeck and UCL. So there was this proposal to put together, to build a GIS centre, basically, in that sense. And that was the reason why CASA was set up and why they managed. The provost at the time, Derek Roberts, always liked to appoint professors, basically. That was his specialty. And he saw himself as appointing professors. And he would always say, if you had a new initiative, go and find a professor and get the professor to do it, so to speak. So that was the way that the CASA began.
Nice.
They couldn't actually provide lots of interesting stories. People on this call probably have heard them before, but lots of interesting stories about they could give you a job, basically. They couldn't find you an office, basically. So when I arrived in '95, Richard Munton in geography, I asked him, the only person I could find on the day I arrived, but basically, where's my office? And he said, oh my God, we haven't got any space here, Mike, It's UCL, basically. It's got worse ever since.
Well, kind of thinking more broadly, bringing Danny into the conversation here. When you moved through all these different places, a couple of them were geography, a couple of them were planning. How did that affect kind of what you study or how you present it, do you think?
Well, I think over the years, and this is not so much to do with planning and geography, over the years I've done less planning. Back in Manchester, I was looking at the planning process, the planning methods, as well as, models of cities in that sense. And some of that early work on the planning process really I continued it into Cardiff days, but I've not done much on it since then, really, in a sense. Although in Cardiff, we were in planning school, so there was a lot of other aspects of planning in that sense. Of course, here at UCL, CASA has never been planning per se, although I have strong link with Bartlett planning, basically, and various people in there and so on. Yeah. Of course, Peter Hall himself had moved back from Berkeley to Bartlett planning about 3 years before I came in that sense. So I knew a lot of people in Bartlett planning in those days. It's changed dramatically. It's much bigger than it was, and so on. And so, in some senses, the planning thing sort of fell a little bit by the wayside in that sense, and the focus was much more GIS visualization, new computer methods, and so on, and then latterly, social physics, which is connected up with the fractal stuff, cellular automata, all these sorts of stuff that really relate to what we loosely call the science of cities. I say loosely, so it's one science of many sciences in that sense. That's the transition.
So just to pick up from Levi's point and kind of start switching gears to my section, one of the things that really fascinates me of your career is that you've built a quite of a chameleonic profile, you could say. Depending on who you ask, they would say, oh, Mike Batty, the planner, or obviously trained in urban planning. But you've also spent a lot of time on departments of geography, and arguably, if you look at your CV, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, is brought into places that wouldn't be the remit of, if that exists, traditional geographers. Is this chameleonic profile something you feel comfortable in first? Or is it something that you feel has been imposed and you would rather just be called city scientist or planner?
No. I don't feel any particular, to me, it's all a seamless whole, in that sense. I mean, that sounds a bit sort of cocky, I know, but I don't see the differences that other people might see in that sense. So, the sort of lizard is still there underneath the spot, so to speak, or whatever. I mean, the spots may be different in different contexts, but the basic vehicle, as it were, and what I'm interested in is pretty constant over the years in that sense. A little bit of change, as I mentioned before, in terms of a little bit less about the methodologies of planning and much more about cities, I think, in that sense.
So
But I don't see it as being problematic in any way.
And do you think this reflects more the evolution of all these disciplines, that perhaps, well, planning has always been focused on cities, obviously, but perhaps you've become more prominent or more visible to geographers or regional scientists, which is another domain that you've had quite a lot of involvement, because the topic of cities throughout the years, and particularly in the last decades, I would say we've seen it gain prominence. And then as someone who was at the forefront of doing research on cities or several aspects of cities, do you think this almost like science catching up with your career more than your career changing and taking different turns?
You know, I mean, if you look at something like fractals, okay, there are many, many ideas about fractals which were developed by geographers long before, you know, Mandelbrot's book, became famous in that sense. I mean, his paper, How Long is the Coastline of Britain, in 1967, really sort of started the field of fractal geometry to excel. Because it goes back indefinitely, really. But in geography, there were lots of examples in terms of river systems and coastlines and boundaries and so on, which people spoke about. The School of Michigan, the Michigan School of Geographers, you know, Waldo Tobler and John Nystuen and all these people, Bungay and so on. It had a lot of those ideas, basically, which connected up quite nicely with fractals. And then, to some extent, more recently, the whole development of, you know, social physics, which again goes back to location theory and so on, you know, Zipf's law and that kind of thing. The whole development of that sort of, you know, allometry and rank size and scaling and so on, again connects up. So I see that as being relatively, so there's a momentum there, which certainly has become more popular in some senses since then. But I don't see that's been driven by a change in the science, except in that context. I mean, there are plenty of things that, you know, I don't do, basically, where you can begin to think they've become more popular in some senses. So, for example, the focus on data, for example, is definitely generated by, you know, real-time stream data and so on, but not just by that, by a new sense in which we can find pattern and structure in data. And that was much less the case, you know, when I was starting out, really, in that sense. So that you could say there's been a switch from deductive thinking, which is where data was less prevalent and less voluminous and so on, to inductive thinking. There's a sort of transition of that kind, which is the switch from theory to data in some sense. I mean, I know that these things are interconnected and combined and iterative and so on. But it has that, I think,
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things that I really wanted to ask you when I was preparing this interview is, when you look, at least from the outset, when you look at how this evolution and how you've, you know, this chameleonic profile that we were talking about a second ago, that it seems that it's all been relatively seamless. And it also, at least from the outset, it looks like it's worked out very seamlessly and very well. And for someone who, I was trained, full disclosure, I was trained as an economist. My PhD and all my training really is in economics. And then now I'm in geography. I see a lot of value in traversing fields, but it's not been, at least from my point of view, it hasn't been super seamless. There's been challenges. You go into, every now and then you go into a bit of a crisis for what are you doing with your life. And part of that, I think, over time, I'm realizing that it's shifting of your interest and shifting of the interest of the field that you are. So I was wondering whether there might be more people in the audience that are also somewhat in between fields. And I was wondering whether, do you have any piece of advice, any piece of wisdom on how can you have a happy life and also still traverse fields and work across disciplines?
Well, I think in my case, where I got involved, I got an interest in what was happening in terms of thinking about cities, modeling cities back in the 60s, which was very much, it didn't really grow out of quantitative geography, it grew out of planning, basically, policy making, you know, it grew out of transportation planning, etc. That to get into that, I had to learn some things that that didn't appear naturally in terms of the courses that I did. I mean, we were trained as architects, planners, and so I had to learn some mathematics. And in my first years after I finished the degree, the undergraduate degree, I learned some mathematics, basically, you know, matrix algebra and stuff like that. I actually attended some courses, basically. At Manchester, there was quite a good econometrics department. Jimmy Johnson, who wrote a book on econometrics, was one of the professors there. So I took some courses in that. And that was quite important. And I think over the years, the sort of the limits to what I do are very much contained in the ability to develop the right mathematics in some sense. That if I had more mathematics, I would have done some things a bit differently, I think, in that sense.
Maybe that's the lesson.
And I think we all face that.
Take a maths course.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, yeah, take a maths course. It's very hard to take if you're not part of the degree program. We used to say in planning school that if you really wanted to be an architect, you had to do 5 years architecture and then go to practice. You couldn't really do geography and become a planner and then an architect, right? You just needed to do all that really basic stuff. And that is true, I think, of many subject areas in that sense. So you pick it up in an anecdotal way afterwards in that sense. I mean, there's no bad thing in doing that necessarily, but it does give you a different perspective on the world, I think, than if you learn it, you know, as a degree in mathematics or something like that, really.
Yeah, so that's a great answer that actually segues very well into the next question I was thinking. One of the things, full disclosure for the audience, when Rachel, Levi, and I were preparing this interview, Mike was really kind to share an autobiographical note that he wrote a few years ago for a compendium in planning. And if you're interested, I strongly recommend everyone reading it because it's full of insight and it's full of just plain funny stories. And one of my favorite ones was when you're talking about how your Manchester days, when you were starting to train as a planner, there's a paragraph there that I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have the text in front of me, but there's a passage there that says, in those days, planning was amazing. We would go in the morning and we would spend the whole morning drawing circles. And then in the afternoon, we would have a session of economics. And then the day after, we would have a little bit of location theory. And then the day after, a bit more of drawing and building. And first, that just sounded a lot of fun. But also, it struck me as a lot more playful and a lot more open-minded than, well, I still think, I mean, I think I would, planning, I think, is now much more of an established discipline. It's much clearer what constitutes a degree in planning. And it's still very interdisciplinary, but it's much more delimited. But it got me thinking whether some of your chameleonic profile, some of your open-mindedness that you've developed over your entire career had to do with those early days where in the morning you would be drawing a circle, in the afternoon you would be learning economic theory, and you would be, and another, I'm remembering now, but another passage that I love is that you say something like, and we were able to take it because we weren't trained as anything. We weren't economists, we weren't mathematicians, hence we were able to take all of the different aspects. How much do you think this has influenced you and kind of helped you build what we would now call an interdisciplinary career, truly interdisciplinary career?
Well, it's very interesting. In fact, I would go as far as to say that, you know, 80% of the week, as I said earlier on, was spent drawing. And of course, when we did all these courses, and we did a lot, you know, design, you know, economics, statistics was taught in a couple of lectures under planning techniques and so on, this kind of stuff. We did this great array of stuff. And of course, we did it, as you said, either in the afternoon and also the evenings. Of course, a lot of these courses were given in the evenings because basically the planning school also had a postgraduate entry, and it had a part-time postgraduate entry, and the part-timers, of course, who would work in the city of Manchester or whatever, would basically come in the evening. So a lot of the courses were in the evening in that sense. So, I mean, this was sort of, it's like as an undergraduate, you go there and it's a sort of completely blank canvas, and the lecturers throw all this stuff at you. And in some senses, we took it basically. There was some sense in which those who couldn't draw very well, at the end of the first year, I remember a couple of, in those days, you get things, if you did well enough at A levels, you get state scholarships, and a couple of people who got state scholarships were pushed on to general arts at the end of the first year because they couldn't draw, basically. And of course, the way they evaluated in that sense was through the studio projects in a way. So it was a blank canvas in that sense, and that has given me has definitely given me a sense of saying, well, if you're confronted with another subject, just try and get with it, basically, in a sense. Try and get the rudiments of it. It's not always very successful. It's very hard as you get older, later in life, and so on. But that's one of the things I think that partly the times in which we lived, very optimistic times, basically, back then in the 60s, and also the fact of we had all of this great smorgasbord of stuff to have.
Yeah, well, so much I would like to cover, but I'm also conscious of time, and I'm conscious that Rachel also has a lot that I would like to ask you. So I'm going to leave it with one final question, and it's again a change of gears, somewhat related to your research, but more generally about how you communicate your research. And this is another of the aspects that I've always been fascinated since I started learning about your work, that you're able to, on the one hand, bring in lots of different disciplines and synthesize them into new insights. But at the same time, you're also someone who's been extremely open to new ways and innovative ways of communicating your research. From the very early on, you were involved in visualization, computer graphics, what was called in the 80s, and now just more generally visualization. But also you cover really all the span. You've written hundreds probably of papers, some of them of extremely wide reach and impact. You've authored several books, but you're also a prolific blogger. You're also somewhat of a Twitter star. Can you say a little bit about how you approach communicating insights from your research? How do you value using different media and different packages, so to speak, for the same kind of results that you want to communicate? And with that, I think I'll pass it on to Rachel.
It's largely visual, I think. I mean, it goes back to those days when we had to draw these circles, basically. It's visual in the sense that, like a lot of things, if you practice and practice and practice, then you can become fairly adept at doing certain things in terms of visualization and drawing and so on. You don't have to be a great artist or anything like that, I don't think. And so in some senses, it's part and parcel of that. If you have a reasonably good command of the visual medium, as well as the verbal medium. Don't forget, I went to a grammar school, and in the grammar school, it was very classic. I mean, you had to, you couldn't actually get in the sixth form. You couldn't even think about university unless you actually, took maths and English and stuff like that at the ordinary level, GCSEs, I guess. And so in some senses, there was a lot of filtering out in that sense. And I was quite good at writing too, in that sense. So drawing and writing. So it's really that kind of blend of things that gives you the ability, I think, to look at different mediums. If you look at the things I send, I only have on my Twitter account, I only ever send out, if I write another paper, I would put it online or so on and just, tell people in a tweet, basically, I've written it, basically. That's really all I do. I feel very guilty about Twitter because I should be looking at everybody else's, as it were, rather than indulging myself on it, in a sense. But I always try and put a diagram in in the thing, because that to me, you know, the sort of, you know, everything I do, I've got some sort of visualization of it in a sense. So that's one aspect, I think, of the communication.
Fantastic. Well, I think Danny has turned off his video so that we could transition to this last piece. And I suppose I should start by thanking you in advance, Mike, for playing along with this piece, and hopefully thank the audience for bearing with us, because we're going to try something new. We thought it might be fun to liven up the conversation a little bit, although why we thought we would need to do that with Professor Mike Batty, I'm not sure. But the idea was that we'd switch gears a little bit and ask you to pretend that you've been invited to a sad dinner party. And we took our inspiration from Desert Island Discs, but where, in case you're not familiar with this radio show, guests on this radio show are asked to imagine themselves as castaways on a desert island. And on reflection, we thought that maybe most of us, after a year of lockdown, are already on a desert island, so to speak, and that maybe a dinner party and some social interaction might be a little bit more fun. So we asked Mike to imagine that he's been invited to this sad dinner party, and to bring with him or suggest 4 people, influential papers, or ideas as dinner companions. All right, 1 book in case he gets bored with those companions and he has to entertain himself, and then some small talk for the mellow after dinner conversation, which of course is the best part of the conversation, including 1 nugget of wisdom, 1 regret, 1 fortuitous event or accident, and 1 formative memory or experience. Now, I've got a little bit less than 15 minutes, so we won't be able to cover all of these details, but of course we're happy to share these afterwards. But I wonder, Mike, if you might just get us started by telling us a little bit about who you would put around your sad dinner party table.
Okay, well, the first person I'd bring would be my mentor from the early student days at Manchester, George Chadwick. And he was the author in 1971 of the Systems View of Planning, which really sort of, you know, encapsulated this sort of more scientific approach of planning. But of course, his PhD itself, which he published, was on the works of Joseph Paxton. And in '66, he produced his book, Park and Town. So I'd bring him along because in many ways, he was an engineer originally trained and then a landscape architect and had a practice in Wilmslow or something like that, I think. And was really a sort of, you know, almost a Renaissance man, really, in that sense. So I'd bring him. I'd also bring Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs' great book, The Death and Life of American Cities, came out in '61. And I remember sitting on a beach in Crete in 1965, first time I'd been abroad, really, reading this book. We'd all been exhorted to buy it, in a sense. It was a Penguin book. So it was about 4 years after it came out. And I couldn't understand what she was on about. She was on about all this stuff about diversity in cities and this sort of thing, and how Robert Moses was destroying New York and all this sort of thing. And of course, that's exactly what we were being taught in planning school, how to do this stuff, right, from the top down, basically, sort of, you know, build high rise, etc. We did projects in planning school, which basically now would be regarded as a disgrace, really, sort of putting people in the high rise. There's some clearance program. So Jane Jacobs, I bring her along because eventually I realized later on in life that her book was all about complexity theory, basically. In fact, when my own book came out, Cities and Complexity, in 2005, various of her friends in Toronto tried to get us together. I nearly met her, but unfortunately she passed away in 2006 before we could actually meet, in a sense. So Jane Jacobs would be another person. The other person I'd bring along would be Christopher Alexander. I never met Chris Alexander, but his book, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, it was his PhD in '64, Harvard University, is a fantastic book about, you know, synthesis and design and so on, and problem solving and so on. So I bring Chris. He's still alive, I think, but not well, I think, now. But and then a fourth person would probably be Britt Harris, who was the doyen of urban modeling in the United States, etc. So these would be the four, basically, in that sense.
So you think do you envision this as sort of a working dinner, or do you think that conversation would tend towards less about research, more just about cities?
I haven't really thought very much about that at all. How would these people gel? Well, of course, I've only met two of them, which was Britt Harris and George Chadwick. Jane Jacobs, I didn't meet, and then Chris Alexander, I didn't meet. I don't know how they gel. I don't think they might gel that well, to be honest, in some senses, although they're all talking roughly about the same thing in some senses in that way. That's an interesting question. Yeah, I'd have to think and ponder that a little bit.
Well, it's okay, because if they didn't gel, you would have your book with you, right? And you could just
No,
go
my
off
book-
into a corner
yeah.
with the book that you've brought.
I'm bringing, basically, I like New York as a place, and the great books on New York to me are all by Paul Auster, basically, and his descriptions of Brooklyn and the city, and so on. He's about the same age as me, I think, Paul Auster. And his book, 4321, it's called. It's 1,000 pages. He's written some brilliant books, basically, all about New York, but and fantasy to an extent. 4321 is a big book that sits on my bedside table, and I've not read it as yet. And it's really about modernist America to some extent. It's a book about America. It's about the last 80 years in America as much as anything else. I need a desert island to be able to find the time to read it, basically, in that sense. Now, the other book, which is quite interesting, and I hadn't really thought about this until I thought about this point you made about which book. There's a book by Craig Brown called 1, 2, 3, 4, and that book came out last year, and I think it was Martin Clark who told me about this. But anyway, Craig Brown's book, 1, 2, 3, 4, is about Liverpool, basically. It's about another great city, and it's about the rise of the Beatles, 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, sort of as they used to begin their songs. And so certainly, but Auster is the book that I would bring, basically.
Excellent. So let's imagine that the meal's been served, you've eaten. I did ask you what you would have for dinner, so maybe you'd like to just share so everyone can be in on the imagination together. What would you have for dinner, and what would you have for dessert?
Well, the real, yeah, I'd eat steak, basically. My son always says that in Britain, you know, that you'd never eat steak in Britain. It's always crap, basically. But steak in America is fantastic, of course. Pete Luger's Steakhouse is one that my son goes to in New York occasionally when he goes. But steak and dessert, I would have vanilla ice cream. So very, very simple kind of tastes in that sense. Of course, you've got to remember that I never actually tasted steak until I was a student, basically. I never actually went in a restaurant until I was as an undergraduate, basically, because, you know, in those days, I mean, people, your mom and dad basically didn't have enough money to be able to go to restaurants and stuff. And there was no restaurant tradition in Britain in the 1950s and 60s, really.
Yeah, I think it's probably difficult for us, if we come from a younger generation, to think about what cities mean to us, how we use cities and what we consider to be amenities compared to people who've been around for longer and have seen cities change, especially English cities in the post-war era. So we're going to transition to what I think will be the sort of fun part of this sad dinner party, the reflective piece. And I'd like to ask you first, since I think the audience would really like to hear this, what would be one piece of wisdom you would share?
Well, a piece of wisdom. That's a difficult one. I mean, I think that I think one needs to persevere and believe in oneself, really. I mean, it's a sort of it's a template that I've always sort of related to, in a sense. I mean, in the sense that if you have an idea, you know, pursue it in that sense. I mean, obviously, you know, it's within limits in that sense, but generally believe in yourself, because no one else is going to believe in you if you don't believe in yourself, basically. You know, I remember in 1967, when I was a graduate student at Manchester, I've got to say I was the only graduate student in the department, in fact, in those days, basically. It was architecture and planning, basically. So, but in 67, John Taylor, who was a gaming simulation expert, invited me to go over and meet some Americans in Sheffield, and so I went across, and I was going to talk to them about my PhD work, basically, which was really on systematic design of cities, Christopher Alexander stuff, and so on. Anyway, I talked to them. They were a bit older than me, And they proceeded to demolish me verbally on terms of everything I said. I was absolutely shell-shocked by this sort of reaction. Supposed to be having a nice conversation, basically. They told me to do everything different. And of course, I sort of brushed it off in some senses, but it so happened that it didn't stop me. It could have stopped me in my tracks. A lot of people, I think it would have stopped in their tracks. I mean, basically, these people really weren't even in my field, as far as I can tell. I was not even sure what field they were ever in. And of course, I've sort of looked them up subsequently, and they're nowhere. They've never been in academia. I don't know who they were, basically, but they were Americans, and they were from Michigan, basically. And so consequently, sort of, it was, and of course, throughout my life, I mean, we all experience this, that particularly if you're in an area like quantitative modeling and so on, people don't believe that you can put numbers on people or anything else for that matter. I mean, and so in some senses, I've had to deal with this over the years, but you got to believe in yourself in that context. So that would be I don't know whether you call it a nugget of wisdom, but that would be my mantra in that sense.
Yeah, well, it's a good mantra, and it's a good piece of wisdom. I wonder, and I'm just thinking about this now, but I mean, I think to most of us, when we look at a career like yours, and Danny and Levi and I have had a chance to spend lots of time with your writings and with your CV, it's hard to tell from the outside whether perseverance was ever necessary. And would you say that you needed to adopt that mantra repeatedly? I mean, was this something that you had to chivvy yourself along with at certain times in your career that you needed to persevere?
Yeah, I think less so in the last 25 years since I've been at UCL, but certainly in the first 25 years, I mean, you know, sort of, yeah, to some extent that was true. I had to less so at Reading. I mean, the different places I've worked have been gentle or severe in some sense. That Reading was quite gentle. I mean, Manchester was different. I mean, you're an undergraduate, but Reading was a pretty gentle place, and Cardiff was a battlefield, as I said. You know, the NCGIA was extremely nice at Buffalo in that sense. Castle has been harder. There's no question about that. You know, we had to fight various groups to, you know, maintain, you know, space syntax in particular in the early days. I mean, bizarre. And anyway, so. In some senses, yes, that point about believing in yourself and pursuing sort of through the various things, but less it's certainly less so in the last 20 years. Sort of, once CASA got established, you know, we found it easier, a little bit easier. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the corollary to the advice is to stick to it for 25 years because things get a little bit better afterwards. Yeah. We're going to run out of time, so I won't be able to ask you about your formative experience, although I think we talked a lot about formative experiences and maybe accidents a little bit, but I wanted to ask you about regret, because I think that's also something that we don't really know how to handle so much when we're at the beginning stages of our career. And maybe when you've had a distinguished career like yours, there aren't so many regrets. But remember, we're at a sad dinner party, and now we've had a little bit to drink, and maybe the lights are low. What would you say would be a regret?
Well, that's hard. That's much harder to say. I mean, I regret to some extent not actually going to America after my degree, basically. I mean, I think that because we went to America, we went to University of Waterloo in the mid-1970s for a year as transport I was in then. And of course, we were then in Buffalo for 5 years, so I did go to America in that sense, but not immediately after the degree. And that would have been interesting, I think, looking back on it. I mean, of course, if I'd have done that, I mean, the number of Brits who in geography, say, who've gone to America is quite large, and many of them have not returned, really, in a sense. So people like Brian Berry and people like that and so on. So that's one regret. Other regrets are, well, more idiosyncratic, really. I mean, I always wanted to drive across from coast to coast and take Route 66 from Chicago to LA and so on. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that now, basically. The pandemic has changed a lot, really, in that sense. So that's another regret. One regret, too, is is the fact that I would have liked to have done much more urban design, and that's really architecture basically. But of course, you know, you choose your path in that sense, and that's not really possible to do that basically. But I could have done that basically, sort of, you know, become an urban designer really, or an architect planner really, in that sense of the word. So yeah, so those are regrets. Yeah.
What is it about Route 66? I mean, I've noticed in all of the conversation today, but especially these answers over the last few minutes, that there is an allure of the US or North America to you, it seems.
Yeah.
And I wonder what it is about Route 66 that.
Well, it's sort of, I mean, it's one of these sort of non-interstate highways. It's before the interstate system to some extent. And the various bits I've been along 66, you know, certainly in, well, as you know, Rachel, from Arizona, basically, and in New Mexico, basically, then it's an interesting road because it's sort of, to some extent, the history of America, modern America, is contained in the architecture along that road in some sense, probably the, you know, the 40s or 30s and 40s and 50s, that kind of thing. So that's one issue about Route 66, really, in that sense.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start to wind us down because I can see the chat sort of exploding. So I think we probably have a lot of questions, but I wanted to close with just a sort of final question. And just to give the audience a little bit of background. Of course, we didn't spring these questions on Mike out of the blue. It takes a little bit of thought to really think about who you'd want to have dinner with at a sad dinner party. It's an exercise you all are invited to take part in. So we gave him some time for reflection. And the thing that was interesting to me when your answers came back was that they were so fully formed as thoughts and so unequivocal. And I don't know what the question is, or if that's really just a comment, but it was interesting to me that these the wisdom and the accidents that they arrive sort of as fully formed.
Mm.
And is that something that you've developed over your life, or do you think you were always such a certain person, and that says something about sort of the direction that your career has taken?
Yeah, I mean, I've been fairly certain, I suppose, in that sense, although my originally getting into planning, I mentioned this to you. I mean, yeah. Why did I go to planning, basically? Well, and I said this at the beginning, that my mum and dad, when we were kids, basically, me and my brother, and my mum and dad take us annual holiday in a guest house, basically. And I mean, anybody who's sort of experienced that knows that in the guest house, you're kicked out. It's bed and breakfast, basically, I think, and maybe evening meal. You're kicked out and so on. So those were always places like North Wales or Blackpool and so on. And in 1958, we went to Lytham St Anne's. And my mum and dad met a couple who had a daughter, and they came from Oldham, basically. He worked for Ferranti. And they got to know them very well. And their daughter was a good artist. And she basically, I think she went to the Slade eventually, which is part of UCL. But she was a bit older than me. But in their process of thinking about university, her father had picked up a prospectus, Manchester, and this was a course called Town and Country Planning, basically. So my dad said, that would be a good course for you, Michael, basically. So, and basically it happened. I mean, basically it was a complete accident in a sense that he sort of planted this seed in my mind. And of course my mum and dad came from Manchester. They were married in Manchester and lived there before the war, basically. And so it was not unknown territory. We had quite a lot of relatives too in the area around. So the reason why I went to Manchester was largely due to this chance encounter. And you could argue that everything I've done ever since, as it were, was set by this sort of accident of fate, really, in this particular context. I talk a little bit about it in the book you wrote, the Encounters in Planning Thought book, which is edited by Beatrice Hasselberger, which is mainly about planners, you know, John Friedman, Patty Healy, people like that, writing in it about their careers, you know.
So I'm going to invite Danny and Levi to turn their video back on, and we do have some questions. I just want to say in that bit about your going to Manchester, I think you closed by saying something about how your mother was really nervous about you going to London, that it was just
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, I mean, she was, I don't know, born in Wigan or somewhere. And I mean, you know, the Northwest, as you know, is sort of pretty much an urban city region, really, both Liverpool and Manchester. And it's a big place. But my mother was always scared stiff of London. It was that next level of the hierarchy up, basically, in some senses. Quite scared about it in a way. She was more scared about my brother going to London. My brother worked in the bank, basically, and Barclays Bank, and they were always moved around and this sort of thing. And so she was scared of London in that sense. By the time we came back to London, of course, she was, you know, almost finished, basically. So she passed on very quickly after that, but not because of going to London.
That would not really sell cities, I think, the way we would like to sell cities.
Oh, no, indeed
not.
No.
So we have a number of questions and comments, and if you're willing, I think we could take another 5 or 10 minutes, and maybe we just sort of cycle through. But early on, when Levi was still talking to you, we had a question from Roger Crematis from Wageningen, and also Kevin Sparks, both of whom brought up the topic of social physics. And so Roger says, social physics is gaining a lot of momentum, but is it well used for long-term urban planning? And would you suggest opportunities for long-term planning applications?
Well, my immediate answer to that question is that I don't think we can predict anything about the future in that sense. And so the idea of planning in the long term is very, very problematic in the modern world, I think. So our views of action are changing very, very radically, I think, in that sense. That it's not at all clear that a lot of what we would call science basically is predictive in the sense that we perhaps imagined it was, you know, in the classical era and so on, you know, mechanics. So in some senses, that's a major issue. Is it any good for longer term things in that sense? I mean, it revolves around this notion of whether we believe there are regularities out there in the aggregate to be discovered and which are meaningful in some sense. Well, of course, some of them are very obvious, like, you know, competition between objects that are growing, so cities, people with income, etc., which lead to, you know, scaling laws and power laws and so on. That looks to be, you know, Krugman says, a kind of iron law, basically, you know, which is one of the core regularities of social physics. Of course, whether we can use it in the long term is very problematic in that sense. I mean, I don't know what the answer is to it, but it's something that needs to be debated continually. It needs to be debated in terms of our ability to predict using not just methods of social physics, but every you know, tool that we've actually got in that sense. So that's my immediate sort of answer. Opportunities for long-term planning. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, there are lots of messages coming in. So I'll turn it over to Levi and Danny each to ask a question, and then we'll sort of see where we are in time.
Okay.
Yeah, Danny, if you'd like to go ahead and ask the next question.
There's one by Kevin Sparks, very much in line with the previous one. And he says there are multiple fields that approach the science of cities in their own way, such as economics, physics, and others. How would you situate what you believe to be important and relevant alongside the likes of, for example, Ed Glaser or Louis Bettencourt? And then he's thanking you for the interview.
Yeah, I'm reading it now. Yeah. Louis, of course, I know very well. I mean, and we've also worked on allometric methods as he has, superlinearity and so on. I mean, to some extent, all of that stuff is Jeff Weston. Well, of course, all of that stuff is very, very much in terms of similar to rank size relationships, etc., power laws and so on. Whether or not, I mean, there's a lot of controversy about those laws because of definitional issues. You know, how do you define a city? How do you find what a person's income is and all that sort of thing and so on. So there are some big questions of that sort. I think Louis' work and West's work and so on fits much more closely to the things that I've been involved in over the years in that sense. Ed Glaser, I think, is his view of urban. Well, I think Ed Glaser is becoming much more focused, if you like, on the more traditional views about cities, the more spatially traditional views about cities than they were. Originally, you know, sort of a lot of urban economists are growth theorists, etc. And I'm not sure that growth theory, which I think Ed was originally sort of motivated by, is now central to his thinking. So I see the Ed Glaser stuff, the Lewis Betancourt stuff, as being fairly consistent in some sense with loosely a science of cities. I mean, the other point that's very important, in my book, The New Science of Cities, I call it The New Science of Cities, but in the preface, I actually say there are many sciences of the city, etc. This is just one. I mean, at one point, I debated in my own head whether I call it a science of cities or the science of cities, you know. But there are many sciences of the city in that sense. And I think Betancourt, Glaser, and so on, they have their particular version in that sense, which sits alongside it. And that really betrays my view that we need a kind of very plural kind of set of theories. We need many theories to actually begin to attack the problems that we've got, to inform them. You then say, well, how do we put all of these theories together if they conflict with one another? I don't know the answer to that, basically, but we do have all these different, you know, parallel and plural viewpoints, really, in that sense.
Nice. Changing gears just a little bit, there was a question from Chris from Nigeria that I think fits kind of well. Chris just switched from geology to geography and is wondering if you have any advice for an entrant to the field. And I wondered if in that kind of way, you might also want to reflect a little bit on how maybe a new entrant to the field might find it different today than you did back then. You know, how has that kind of changed a little bit?
Well, the biggest change has been the sheer explosion of stuff to read, the literature. I mean, it's just mind-boggling now. I mean, the ability to handle large quantities of information, much of which may be very similar, basically, in some sense, if you're able to distill it all, is a real issue, I think, in that sense. I mean, back in the day, I mean, in the 60s, when we were beginning to talk about urban models, for example, land use transport models, I mean, you could meet, and I did, everybody in the field, basically. We met them all, basically, and within about 5 minutes of even beginning to think about meeting them, we met them. But now, I mean, if you're into a land use transportation model, there's a vast amount to read just on that area itself, really, in a sense. And that's a relatively small corner of what we're talking about. So that's a big issue in terms of being an academic. What does one need to select in some sense? How does one need to focus in some respects in that particular context? And that's important to being an academic, because you're not just an academic in geography, you're an academic in some aspect of geography in that sense. I'm not suggesting that you don't know about the field in general, of course, one would hope so, but also in terms of making a mark in that sense. So switching from geology to geography, then one has to think about what type of geography in that sense and what perspective in that way.
That's fair. That's understandable. I think we are definitely over time. We have kind of space for one last question that I think might be useful from Anna Basiri. She asks, what is kind of the ratio between sort of applied challenge-driven research versus kind of methodological innovation? Let's build a hammer and we'll find a nail later, kind of blue sky research in your career. How do you see that balance between applied and sort of basic or fundamental research?
Well, I think that I think we all sort of, you know, have we all, if you like, approach the world from the point of view of the hammer and the point in some sense that it's often difficult to separate them, but there's no question that we do learn things, and once we've learned them, we try and apply them regardless in that sense, which is more the hammer approach. The nail, of course, to some extent is the problem. How do you actually knock it in, basically? What do you knock it in with in that sense? And that's really the other side of the same coin in some senses. So it seems to me that, well, what Anna is asking here is that, you know, what is the ratio or balance in some sense between the hammer and the nail in some sense? That's a tricky one. I think it depends on the context. It depends on the nature of the problem, depends on the times in which we live to some extent in that context, what we consider to be important. And I think what we consider to be important in that sense, it is actually driven by the knowledge and theories and methods that we have, but it's also driven by much broader perceptions about, you know, the kind of times in which we live, the cultural and, you know, social context in that particular in that way, and that does vary over time. It's different now and so on, or in the 80s and this kind of thing. Not really an answer to the question, Anna, I'm afraid, but some comments really just on the difficulty of thinking in terms of hammer first, nail after, or vice versa.
Awesome, thanks. Well, with that, I'll hand it over, I think, to Danny to close.
Yep. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for sticking around through what was a clear, well, not freestyle, but it was definitely charting into new territory. So hopefully this wasn't as enjoyable for you as it was for Rachel, Levi, and I to prepare, and hopefully for Mike to be involved. We're going to draw it to a close here, as Rachel said, we're a bit over time. Before we leave, I'll make a quick announcement and tease that this was the first of hopefully many, but definitely 4 more interviews that are coming up. We have 4 scheduled, and we'll be dropping the names little by little over time, so you don't binge on all of them at once. But what we will say is that the next one is May 4th, same time. So we'll be 4 p.m. same place. We'll be meeting in the same corner of the internet, and we'll be dropping the link very soon. And our next interviewee will be Professor Luke Anselin, who's many things, but among them is professor at the University of Chicago and has the Center for Spatial Data Science. So we'll be dropping more details as the days come, but please stay tuned, and hopefully we will see you all very soon. Thank you very much.
Can I just ask Rachel or Danny, are you saving the chat? There's a lot of questions.
Yes. Yeah, we're going to save everything. That's the one good thing about the live.
Indeed,
but
yes.
Yeah.
I'll try and answer.
Thank you so much, Mike, for being our guinea pig,
yes.
being our inaugural SAD interview. It was excellent.
And I'd also like to mention that next week, for those of you following the seminar series that are under the SAD seminars, we'd like to welcome Professor Sergio Ray giving a talk on big code.
Oh, right. Okay, great.
So please do, if you'd like another seminar, join us for that. Otherwise, join us on May 4th with Luke Anselin. So wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Bye. See you soon. Yeah. Cheers.